Welcome back to the Space Alvey Institute podcast. I'm Andrew Petiprin with Bobby Mixa. Bobby, it's been a while. How are you?
It has, man. It's been such a long time that I think it was the beginning of winter here, and now it's almost spring. So, and that's a long time in Krakow.
Yeah, we're recording this towards the end of February, and we've had a lot of reasons why we've kind of not been as regular as we would have liked. One of them, Bobby, I just want to mention is the death of your wife's father. And so, I'm so sorry for her. And I know that our listeners, anybody who knows her will know what a delightful woman she is. And so, of course, her father must be a very good man to have produced such a great daughter. So I'm sorry about what you and Magdalena are going through, and hope everything's okay.
Well, it's kind of you, Andrew. Yeah, he was a great man. I mean, he literally one of the last things he did was build this shed right in our backyard. So yeah, he was a great man. And he really welcomed me into the family. And even though my Polish was very sparse, we somehow really got along and communicated very well. But he was my travel companion here in Poland. Whenever I said, hey, I want to go see this thing, he was always ready for a big trip. So we were hoping to go see Prague, but unfortunately, that his cancer came back, and it came back very aggressively. So,
Well, I'm sorry, and I know what it's like to lose a father, to lose a parent, and so I know what Magdalena's feeling, but you can never know exactly what anybody else is feeling. So just know how sorry I am about that. Yeah.
Thanks, man.
Well, hey, it's been a while, and one of the things that we've just been kind of processing or thinking about on our own and in our own private conversations with each other is just how it feels like we're living in a different world. And over the last few months, with the return of Donald Trump to the White House, and with kind of these sweeping changes that have taken off right at the beginning of his second term here, and for some people that's bad news, for some people that's good news, for a lot of people it's kind of something in between, depending on what the particular thing is that is happening. But one of the things that I thought we could talk about today, or that we discussed in advance, that we thought would be interesting to our listeners, is something that is near and dear to our hearts, is our place as Americans as part of what we might call like a greater Europe, or as sort of Western civilization writ large. And where does our hope lie in terms of like that patrimony, that inheritance that we've received, and what do we do with it? I say all this because it was in the news recently that our Vice President JD Vance, and maybe we'll say more about him and various other things about things he's said in other contexts, but JD Vance is this really interesting figure, somebody that I think matters a lot to us. He's a younger Catholic. He's a convert to the Catholic faith. And he's now in this extremely influential position, obviously, as Vice President of the United States. He's close to the most, kind of close to the center of power of the whole world, really. And he's already made some pretty interesting statements and done some pretty interesting things. And I thought we might start by discussing some of the things he said at the Munich Security Conference, which took place, let's see, about 10 days ago from when we're recording. It took place on February 14th, which everybody thinks of as Valentine's Day. But actually, in the calendar of the church, it's the feast day of St. Cyril and Methodius, who are, along with St. Benedict, the patron saints of Europe. So I thought that was really interesting. Yeah. Now, let me throw this to you. Let me read this quote to you, and maybe this will kind of get the ball rolling. One of the things he said in his speech was, he said this. He says, "What I worry about is the threat from within, the retreat of Europe from some of its most fundamental values shared with the United States of America." That resonates, I think, with a lot of the things you and I have already talked about, some of the guests that we've had on past podcasts, some of the things we've written. So what's your reaction to that statement? And maybe I'll just sort of throw it to you to give me your reflections.
Yeah, no, I really, Andrew, you were the one who told me about this speech. So I immediately, typed it into YouTube and listened to it. And those lines really stood out to me. And it was like, hey, this is exactly what we're about. So it was, I thought that this was, I mean, even though it's delivered on Valentine's Day, I mean, quite a Valentine to the European leaders. The line though about the values, I thought he has a comment in there as well about like, hey, I've been, hearing a lot about like what we should be, defending ourselves against, but not what we're for. And when he uses the word like value, I mean, it's that kind of like, what's that kind of like ultimate goal to which we're tending? What is that substantial thing? Like, in what do we place our hope in some way? That really stood out to me. And I thought it was a great reminder that, to come to Europe on this feast of the patrons of Europe, to look at actually what are those values. And I know like it was the defense, conference, the famous, Munich Defense Conference. And, it was interesting to see the reactions right after he delivered that speech, not to get too far, but I think it was one of the secretaries of defense in Germany had said, this is unacceptable. You can't come here and we're just quite fine. We don't need any lectures in democracy. And then he goes on to actually try to articulate what those values are that they defend. And I thought, oh my gosh, once again, secular enlightenment, so boring. And it's like this kind of just these formal things, which you almost feel like, they'd be citing Immanuel Kant to try to articulate what the substance is. But, as somebody who kind of was a great critic of Kant, Friedrich Nietzsche, sometimes you need to look at, well, what actually is upholding those secular values that you say are just kind of, are derived from secular reason. And I thought that, like, in some ways, his quoting of John Paul II at the very end was someone who just saw exactly that no, you can't have all these things you're trying to defend in Europe and also in the West in particular without having, and he doesn't do this, but he kind of hints at it a little bit with the "do not be afraid" quote, and also bringing up the example of abortion. They can't have that without having this kind of theological, vision that's at the core of this thing we call Europe. So, anyways, those were my thoughts. I mean, Andrew, this was quite the speech. I mean, I thought it was a great lesson in. I mean, people are saying, "Oh, it's so populist," but his line too, that democracy rests on the sacred principle that the voice of the people matters, and then saying, and there's no room for firewalls. You either uphold the principle or you don't. Okay, I'm trying to see here. Well, like what in the context of being a champion of democracy and not being afraid of the people. Well,
so that line, the line where he mentioned, I just want to interject this one thing, but because you're on a roll, but that line about no firewalls was very strategic, because the word in German that is used to essentially keep what has been called the far right up to this point sort of out of power is the word firewall. That's the word that they use in German. And that refers to Alternative für Deutschland, the AfD party, the so-called far right party, right? That, I mean, the German elections have just taken place yesterday, and it appears that even though the AfD got the second most amount of votes, that they will not be a coalition partner with the center right, who got the most votes, right? So, Vance was kind of alluding to this, that like you're afraid of, like, the do not be afraid is you're afraid of your own people. Like, basically, like he's looking out on these elites, these generals and these bureaucrats and stuff, and he's like, there's no way that you're going to have a thriving society if you are literally afraid of your own people, right? Which I thought was not only just extremely unusual to hear from like an American politician going to Europe and talking, but just really bold. I mean, just, and I mean, it makes sense that he would say that, because of course, like he, in some respects, he represents this like kind of return of the voice of the people, I suppose. But I don't know, like maybe, I don't know where to go from here, but just, you're in Europe, right? I mean, you're in Poland, not in Germany or whatever, but I mean, I would imagine there were people in Europe, including in Poland, who heard those words a little differently maybe than the way that they sounded back home here in America.
Yeah. I saw that Donald Tusk, who's the prime minister of Poland right now, tweeted something about those words, and I can't exactly remember what he said, but it was something I did not like what he had to say, and I generally don't care for Donald Tusk. But
Yeah.
yeah, I mean, like in the context of like communism, I mean, I think that was what he was trying to get at. But it's interesting. I mean, like, I was thinking, okay, who are the people? And the people of Poland. It's interesting in this moment. I'm trying to like get a sense of like what do Poles think about all of the things that have been happening in the last couple of days in this strategic move on behalf of the Trump White House. But I've been thinking like, okay, it's interesting. Some of them are actually really, really, really happy the direction that they're taking things. And generally speaking, I think a lot of Poles are very sympathetic to Trump. But I'm trying to get a read on the whole situation with Ukraine and Russia right now. But leaving that aside, I think that it's interesting is like a lot of Poles think that what's going on in Western Europe is just ridiculous. And so JD Vance's, like, if you want to say return or revolution of common sense, just seems to, I don't like the term revolution, but just bringing back common sense, like, makes a lot of sense to them. And that's what's lacking. And also, too, like, being ruled by these technocrats is something that they just don't like. So in Poland, there's a great stress on freedom. I mean, they call it like złoty wolność, the golden freedom. And, a lot of Poles are kind of like, heck, we've been fighting off all of these totalitarian regimes. And yet now we've always seen ourselves as part of the West, and we're glad to be part of the West, I guess again. But what are those values that they're for? And so JD Vance bringing that up, I think a lot of them really appreciated that.
Yeah, I want to come back to Ukraine stuff in a minute because that's something that we've talked about before, and I'd love to pick that up in 1 second. But I first want to pick up on this idea of what Vance is sort of articulating Europe or the West being for, right?
Yeah.
There was one part in the speech when he said, "Unfortunately, when I look at Europe today, it's sometimes not so clear what happened to some of the Cold War's winners." In other words, it's like, look, John Paul II got up there and said, "Don't be afraid." We had Reagan and Thatcher, and all of this. Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall. We won the Cold War, and now you guys are like arresting old ladies on the street in Britain for praying silently. Now you guys are like, you have, in Germany, they're like throwing people in jail for social media posts, stuff like that. It's like, what are you guys doing? It's like you. Now, I mean, I suppose, and maybe this gets into JD Vance's own, his own background, his own kind of the evolution of his own thought process or whatever. But I mean, there maybe is some debate to be had, right, over, are we talking about sort of like pure libertarianism in terms of freedom, or are we talking about like, what are we talking about when we're talking about sort of like the freedoms and like how to embrace them and all that sort of thing, and how they relate to kind of building a Christian civilization or whatever that may be. And maybe I think there's probably some room for discussion in there.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Go ahead.
But I think for him, even though to bring these things up, that calls for this discussion. Mm-hmm. I mean, what do you think?
Yeah, right. I mean, we can't just like, there are all these platitudes, right? I mean, even in the United States, I like to think maybe we're pushing back against that now a little bit more. But you would hear, I remember even just a few years ago, you'd hear it spoken just as a kind of platitude, things like, hate speech is not free speech. People would just say that sort of thing, and I was like, well, wait, what are you talking about? You need to really define your terms if you're gonna throw something out like that. Okay, yes, if it's inciting a particular act of violence, yes, you and I agree, that's not free speech. But if it's just somebody expressing an opinion that seems off color or that seems distasteful or whatever that or offensive or whatever that may be, sorry, that's the price of living in a society like the one we've chosen, right?
Yeah.
And in Europe, it seems like they're still, at least in certain parts of Europe, still really struggling over those kinds of questions.
Yeah. I did see our friend John Milbank tweeting out some things about the critical of Vance. Democracy is not kind of like an ultimate end. But leaving that aside, I think you know who I was thinking about the whole time when I was listening to his talk, and especially at the end there was somebody I know who greatly influenced, who still influences JD Vance, and somebody I think we should have on the show is Patrick Deneen.
Yeah, I thought about him too. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, like his whole thing about, okay, so we've got these institutions, okay, these liberal institutions which are to protect all these things, but in some ways they end up undermining those things in the very protection of them. So, like, for example, I mean, you bring up, I could see a bunch of Europeans saying, okay, no, actually, we're the democratic institutions. We have to then protect all of these voices and these minorities. But then all of a sudden, what ends up happening is you have the state and the individual, and it ends up eroding all of those very things, like those intermediary, communities that made the institution of democracy possible, and also made the individual and the full if you want to say dignity of the individual possible there. And so it ends up kind of eroding, though, that fabric of society that would then make itself possible. And so that's where you end up in such a situation, and it's hard for people who were the ones in the audience to see those things. Because I mean, you'll see that in the responses to his immediate, response to his talk. So.
Yeah. I wonder if we can stick with his talk. Maybe we can jog back, into it and out of it. But this reminds me of something else that I wanted to bring up about JD Vance, which is in January, I think it was January 30th, he gave an interview on Fox News with Sean Hannity, where he was asked. Yeah, I can't remember the specific context, whether it was the border wall or whether it was the end of USAID, or it may have been a combination of all of these things. But it was basically like raising the issue of, okay, it seems like the United States is suddenly becoming much more concerned about its own character, its own identity, its own security. So we're back to talking a lot about limiting immigration. We're back to like pulling out of our entanglements with, for example, in Ukraine, maybe elsewhere. Again, I want to talk more about Ukraine, but like what's kind of if it maybe for us, we would want to think of this in terms of like, what's the theological rationale, or like what's the kind of philosophical rationale for, going in one direction or another. And JD Vance said this. He said, your compassion belongs first to your fellow citizens. It doesn't mean you hate people from outside your own borders, but there's an old school and Christian concept that you love your family, and then you love your neighbor, and then you love your community, and then you love your fellow citizens in your own country, and then after that you can focus and prioritize the rest of the world. So now, a lot of people pointed out that this is what's called in theology Ordo Amoris, that kind of the order of love that we find in Augustine. It's funny, whenever these things come up, people say, that's Thomistic, and then people will say, no, that's Augustinian, and then other people will say, it's just the Bible. I mean, or it's just like whatever, it's just Western philosophy, whatever. It seems like you can always kind of keep going back, and you don't have to necessarily pin it to any one person or one school of thought. But I thought this was interesting. And then I'll throw it to you, but I thought this was interesting for a number of reasons. One, it's interesting just from the perspective of who controls the narrative in terms of like what real Christian charity is, and what kind of our obligations to our neighbors are and stuff like that. But then it also relates to that other bigger question, I think, that we were talking about with regard to Vance's speech, which is like, are we thinking in terms of like some abstract people? Are we thinking in terms of like our duty to humanity, and therefore kind of not really understanding how that works in our day-to-day lives, in our civic life? And it seems to me that Vance is saying just that. That is like, we've got the order all wrong, and so therefore we're not really able to be charitable to anybody at all.
So you're saying things like, okay, let's, with taking away things like USAID, and then also like all the money that's going to Ukraine, like how much money was it? It was like 500 billion or something.
We're going to get in trouble if we start being precise, but billions and billions.
Yeah, right? Billions, okay. But like looking at that, and then, in Vance's own where he grew up. I mean, why aren't you why aren't you taking care of the very people of your neighbors who are right here in front of you? So is that kind of what you're hinting at? Like, why are we so concerned about, the geopolitical situation, like in the part of the world where a lot of Americans probably would I mean, no, how many Americans are going to go to Ukraine?
Right. Well, that's the thing. It's not that we shouldn't care. It's not that we shouldn't care. And I want to say I still have a slightly nuanced view, maybe a somewhat heterodox view compared to the mainstream right nowadays about Ukraine. And so, I mean, it's a complicated issue. I think it still is.
No, I totally agree with you on that. But that's what you're trying to articulate.
Yeah, but like as an American taxpayer, there definitely has to come a point where I'm like, obviously we can't just keep paying for that. We can't, right? Because we have our own country to think about. And so if we go a layer back from that and a layer back from that and a layer back from that, then obviously we know. And I think that this is totally consistent with Catholic social teaching, right? That like on some level, you're always worrying about the smallest level first, and then you build out from there as best you can. But even just running a household, being a married man, or if you have children or whatever, that like if you like put all your energy into somebody who's outside your house, then it's going to take away from the energy that is required for you to give to the people who live under your own roof. That's just a fact, right? And I think that's what JD Vance is getting at, and I think that somehow is coming across as controversial, and I don't know why.
Yeah, I mean, I don't see it like, okay, if you're totally ignoring the people who are on the outermost ring, whoever that is, but yeah, I mean, I see that it's to care for those who are right in front of you, who you have responsibilities to. I mean, I didn't see what was so controversial about that. But on Twitter, supposedly people are giving him a lecture on, just getting all the theology and Catholic social teaching wrong, which, I had a really hard time trying to like understand, well, precisely what did he get wrong? I mean, he's not like calling people to ignore the people who are in the outermost ring. It didn't seem to be the case. But I mean, I just saw it just seemed to me, and correct me if I'm wrong, but like, I mean, the principles of like solidarity and subsidiarity, it just seemed to me that, okay, well, yeah, we have solidarity with those who are suffering, and as, extended as far out as that community, would be, but we also have to like take into consideration those who are closest to us. I mean, I could be reading that completely wrong.
Yeah, no, I think that's exactly right. And a word about JD Vance's faith, I think, is pertinent to this. So I engaged with somebody on Twitter about this matter, because this person on Twitter said that basically like Vance still has too much of a kind of Protestant individualistic way of thinking. Yeah. Now, I took issue with this for a couple of reasons. One was he was technically never a Protestant. I understand that he grew up in
he wasn't baptized.
He was never baptized. I get that he grew up in a kind of Appalachian Protestant cultural milieu. He grew up a cultural Protestant. I get that. So I in a sense, like maybe I'm splitting hairs, but I did want to make this. I did want to like point out the technicality that if he was never baptized in the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, then technically we are actually talking about a person who's not growing in faith, hope, and charity, right? Who is like really outside this whole framework of what we're talking about when we're thinking of like Christian duty and Christian responsibility, right? Yeah. So, okay, maybe that's a technicality, but as it happens, when he became a Christian, he was baptized as a Catholic, and it was only in 2019. It wasn't that long ago, right? Yeah. Now, the next point I wanted to make
about... That is something. I forgot that it was so recent.
Yeah, it was super recent. And what was he before that? Well, okay, he was a cultural Protestant, but as he came of age, he joined the Marine Corps. He was a whiz kid undergraduate who got his degree at Ohio State. Then he went to Yale Law School. He, by his own account, in a really wonderful essay, I have it up on my screen, that he wrote in The Lamp back in 2020. He basically, so this is shortly after he was baptized and confirmed in the Catholic Church. He wrote a sort of testimony about becoming Catholic, which interestingly enough is called How I Joined the Resistance, which to me is a very clear way of him saying, like, becoming Catholic for him was totally revolutionary, right? Yeah. It was his way of understanding the world in a completely different way. And at one point in the article, let me just read this to you real quick, and then I'll throw it back to you. But he says this, he says, I felt desperate for a worldview that understood our bad behavior as simultaneously social and individual, structural and moral, that recognized that we are products of our environment, that we have a responsibility to change that environment, but that we are still moral beings with individual duties. And it seems to me like what he was grappling with up to his conversion is this dilemma of, for whom am I responsible and how do I interact with them?
Yeah.
Right. And he found in the Catholic Church the way to do that, which I think is consistent with what he's articulating, even though it sounds for some reason to be beyond the pale nowadays to people.
Yeah. And, and bringing in the Munich speech, I mean, that he quoted John Paul II. Can you think of somebody who was trying to address those questions of responsibility in the 20th century more than John Paul II? Right. I mean, love and responsibility, it's just not sexual ethics. If you look at his other work, Person and Act, I mean, the very, that I'm not just conditioned by these structures, but that I act. But yet the structures do matter and they do influence me. So, I mean, I think, if anything, Andrew, I mean, this was like, JD Vance has actually inspired me to go back and look at John Paul II on his writings on democracy and his writings on, freedom in general. And there's such a nuanced view, but, that attraction to and maybe we could talk a little bit about this too, that the fact that he called this joining the resistance. I mean, this is when you present the kind of the depths that he, I think, is articulating to the European leaders of these values that he wants. There's so many young men today, and not just particularly young men, but young people who have kind of like grown up in this, like, if I don't call it like maybe it's too strong of a word to call it nihilism, but this void that they are looking for something like that will to join the resistance precisely. And I haven't taken a look. I haven't read that Lamp piece, but it seems like so many young guys like that I've been meeting. I mean, it's almost like if they have, you can generally tell like where they fall. But if some of them kind of show a little bit of a like they're not going to go into some kind of I don't know. They don't like spout out immediately the platitudes of the day. There's something radical in all of them. Like they want to get to the roots. And they're much more willing to do that than I think some of the others. Now, I think that could actually become quite a danger too. And we may see this with older generations who are concerned about where things like AFD or some of these other groups on the right are where they want to take things. And I do have some concerns about AFD. I mean, when somebody called AFD Conservative Party to me the other day, and I'm like, what? Do you know much about AFD? But and I also have big concerns about. I mean, I find Elon Musk to be funny, and I like some of the things he does, but I do have like big problems with Elon Musk. That's another discussion. But I think it's pertinent to this discussion because Go ahead. Yeah, I mean, like just to like wrap this up, I think though that like this desire to get at the roots and to try something new, not new in the sense, I mean, new but old. Is something that people are looking for. And just one last thing is because I have to teach this each year, we have to always do this depth study on the rise of Hitler. And it seems like there's this good article in First Things. I forget what it's called, but it's basically on the religion of Hitler, where it's like we constantly have to tell again the story of how Hitler rose to power precisely with democratic means, you know?
Yeah.
And so we're always so kind of alert to anything that perhaps could repeat that situation. And so
Right.
this is where I think some of the people are like, you know, just, I think, you know, maybe overreacting to anything that sniffs, you know, that smells of Hitler.
Yeah, I think I heard Michael Knowles the other day make some remarks about this. Another prominent Catholic man of the right. He pointed out something that's pretty obvious but worth saying. It's that, you know, there does seem to be such, you already said it, but I'll just sort of say it again. I mean, there's such a fixation on Hitler's rise to power, and for good reason, because I mean it is just truly horrifying, right? And the results of it, I mean, just kind of ruin the world, really. But that said, you know, it's like we have in our heads that that's the only story, right? To the point where we end up with the same figure, right? We end up with a figure like Donald Trump, who's like, you know, when was it? A couple years ago on Time Magazine with the Hitler mustache, and he's literally Hitler. And then now with the Ukraine-Russia stuff, I just saw a caricature, cartoon sort of thing of him the other day, dressed like Neville Chamberlain, like he's appeasing. Like he's supposed to be appeasing Putin. It's like, well, which one is he? Is he Chamberlain or is he Hitler? You know, it's kind of hard to figure that out, right? Now that said, you mentioned the AfD, and I don't know a whole lot about them, but something that does worry me a little bit. You might have noticed, you mentioned Elon Musk, that he was speaking at something, and he gave this sort of weird, like, sort of hand motion at the end of it that kind of looked like a Nazi salute, right?
Yeah.
And I really do believe him when he says, like, he was just not really thinking about what he was doing. He just stuck his arm out there, right? Whatever. But since he did that, some other people have done it. Steve Bannon did it. And also this guy, Calvin Robinson, did it at these big public things. And they're doing it on purpose. And they're doing it as a way to be provocative or whatever. And I think that is really stupid, and more than stupid. I mean, I think that's the kind of thing that has the potential to kind of squander whatever good momentum there is here. And this is where I think, like, it's just going to be so important in my view, and people may disagree, but like, to me, when I hear somebody like JD Vance speak, even though he's very young, I hear a real maturity, and I hear a real sort of like, he's not just cosplaying this thing, right? This isn't just a kind of big joke, and it isn't just about owning the libs. It isn't just about drinking the liberal tears or whatever, right? I sense the same thing when I listen to Marco Rubio talk, the Secretary of State. Like, he may say some provocative things, and he doesn't talk like the previous Secretary of State, but he's a mature, humane person, right? I mean, he's not going to be walking around throwing around so-called jokey Nazi salutes. So this is just stuff that's on my mind as we're like moving into what is clearly a new era now.
Yeah, so let's talk a little bit about that new era. I mean, because Marco Rubio is leading discussions on a lot of the between Russia and the U.S. now as Secretary of State. So, like, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, gosh, you know, I was thinking back recently to when we had Eva Thompson on our show, who is just such a terrific thinker about.
I've been following. You got to follow her Twitter, like when all this stuff is going on, because I always want to get a sense of what she's saying.
Yeah, and I mean, something that I think you and I both agreed with Eva Thompson about when she was on the show, and this was a long time ago. I mean, you know, I would say things have changed somewhat in kind of the global view of like what's going to ultimately happen with Ukraine and Russia and stuff like that. But you know, in some respects, even then, I was a little leery of like, gosh, can we just sort of fund a war in Ukraine forever? Like, what is this going to mean? Yeah, I mean, I was still kind of a little. You know, I was conflicted in some respects in my mind then. But what I wasn't conflicted about then, and am still not conflicted about, is that Vladimir Putin is no good, man. No good. And so there is something kind of weird and frustrating about, again, certain people on, maybe we would say sort of on the right, who are, you know, kind of almost sort of apologists for him and for the way that he does things.
Yeah, I mean, like,
I think that's
Carlson. I mean, it seems like,
I mean,
everything he does now and everybody he invites on his show is an apology for Russia.
Right. So I mean, if the Ukraine are going to lose this war and lose territory, which it looks like they will, I think that's horrible. I mean, it's a tragedy, and I feel terrible for the people of Ukraine. And I do buy the argument that Eva Thompson presented to us, that essentially they're much more akin to Western thinking. Like they really see themselves as participating more in kind of the world of NATO and the EU and all of that sort of thing. I don't buy the mythology of Vladimir Putin, this whole kind of, some kind of like, I don't know, mythological spiritual claim on these lands or something, yeah. Right? But what I hear from somebody like Marco Rubio is just a kind of, I think that he acknowledges the same kinds of things that I'm saying here, but he is ultimately negotiating on behalf of his people, America, who have certain interests that are ultimately not going to align perfectly with with ultimately the independence or the free, whatever, like everything that Ukraine wants. So I don't know, I'm babbling, but what do you think about that?
No, I'm torn about this. I mean, I get it. I feel bad for the Ukrainians because, definitely they want to be part of a greater defense umbrella like NATO. But yet Russia's not going to allow that. And so it made sense to me that like Putin would say, hey, absolutely not. And I will invade if we get close to, not trying to defend Putin's step to finally invade and do that. But it's a tough spot. And these lands here, I mean, with having a neighbor like Russia, I mean, they know for centuries of all the policies of Russification and other control. I mean, it's really kind of a sad predicament to be in. But like I do kind of like from the realist point of view understand that, hey, this thing needs to end. Like Pete Hegseth came out here I think last week or 2 weeks ago, and he said basically, Ukraine is not going to, I don't know if he said Ukraine's not going to retake those lands like the Donbass and Crimea. And yeah, it just doesn't seem like they're they're at the point where they could even do that, to strive for that. And bringing this thing to an end seems to make sense. I mean, I don't know what the numbers are, but it's just horrific, and they're really depleted. I mean, there's some people in the geopolitical world who are saying that you got to keep pushing because Russia, the demographics in Russia are not good, and they're really at the point of breaking. And likely Russia will, after Putin, go into some type of chaos. But we'll see. But I do understand the strategy as well of saying, hey, you can't have Russia and China get too close. And I don't know, but that's all like geopolitics. I'm no good in that, and I just pretty much repeat what I read on Twitter.
Yeah, I wonder maybe then to bring it back to kind of more of a spiritual, theological, philosophical perspective. Like, I mean, there are all these competing voices about like what is our duty, and I think that this is a real predicament that we've been in since the end of the Cold War, where it's like, the Cold War ended and there's one superpower left in the world, the United States. But it's obvious to people even then who are paying attention that like China's roaring, it's rising. Stuff with Russia is not just gonna they're not just going to kind of normalize into a sort of, reunified Germany type country or whatever. I mean, it's like there were big problems on the horizon, right? And then we got sidetracked for all that time with the war on terror and the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan and stuff. And it seems like only now we're finally coming up for air from some of that and like really asking questions and taking a look at things and asking ourselves, like, as the most powerful country in the world, America, like, what is our duty? What are we really supposed to be doing out there in the world? I mean, do we go back to something like the Monroe Doctrine? What do we do? Right. And like, and I think that question is always intertwined with these same kinds of like questions of Christian responsibility that we've already been talking about, that JD Vance was sort of trying to put on the table at this Munich conference, much to people's kind of shock and dismay,
Yeah. And it's good to see because that somebody who's actually in politics doing that as a Catholic, because there's so many people too on the cultural scene today who are saying, hey, let's just, all this modern culture, it's just the machine. There's really, we shouldn't even try to work in that system at all, because we'll just be, compromised as Christians, and just let it go down the path that it's, inevitably going to go to its own destruction, and try to form like little, I don't know, Benedict option communities ourselves. But I like JD Vance entering into the scene, saying, no, actually, we do have this responsibility. I think that, like, and also bringing up the questions about like the moral values of, not the moral values, but just the values and whatever. I hate that term value, just to kind of say this out loud. I hate the term value, because it just seems like, I always think of the Big Lebowski. I like, well, that's just like your opinion, man. It's just it sounds like such a subjective thing. But I'm telling you, this really inspired me. Vance really inspired me to go look at JP2. And how he understands, because he understands that term value, because he uses that all the time. But also inspired me to go look at Ratzinger's writings on Europe. Because, for how many years were those two pontiffs fighting with the Europeans to say, hey, come on, don't go down this one path of kind of the secular enlightenment. Just don't go down there. There's much more substance to this other path that's in your own history, and reclaim that. And so, I think JD Vance, maybe one day we can have him on this podcast to talk about some of these things and host him in Europe, Andrew.
Maybe he knows we exist.
Well, yeah, they'll probably kick him out of Munich now. He could there'll be probably enough polls to invite him.
Not to toot our own horns, but I think we may have one or two mutual friends with the vice president. It's weird how, there are these not too many degrees of separation. But yeah, I was thinking about JP2 and Ratzinger Benedict as well. Not to get too controversial, I guess, with our current pontiff, but Pope Francis clearly, some of the things that I think he definitely gets right, and that we give thanks for, is he has insisted over and over again about kind of the primacy of the human, right? And that the kind of, humanity itself is in danger in large part because of technocracy, and because of the I guess we could maybe in the best light call it like unforeseen consequences of the uses of technology, and
Laudato Si is a great encyclical.
Yeah, and like market forces that are out of the control of any governments or elected, like unaccountable markets and all these kinds of things. I think I hope that, when our Holy Father goes to his reward, that he will be remembered for that sort of stuff, because I think that stuff is really, really profound. That said, and you can jump in, but I just wanted to make this one point. That said, the way that he has articulated kind of human community and sort of human agency and stuff like that seems to me very different from what you get in the philosophy of JP2, and then in kind of the, I don't know what you'd call it, kind of the ethical, theological work of Ratzinger, both of those men being, very European in their, and very Western in their kind of commitments, right? And I definitely think there's very much been a change in the way that our current pontiff talks.
Yeah, but remember that talk he gave when he received the Charlemagne Prize? I don't know if and what's interesting is, so he received, I think in 2017, he received the Charlemagne Prize, which I don't know too much about that prize, but he reflected a little bit on Europe. And in the talk, he actually mentions a book called The Idea of Europe by famous, mentor of Hans von Balthasar, Erich Scherwara. And he talks about that as kind of going back to the cultural patrimony of Rome. And what's really interesting with that is he tries to articulate the identity of Europe, the European roots, but he really does put an emphasis. I got to go back and look at this whole document. But he really tries to say it's kind of like an integrating power. So multiple peoples can come, so as to avoid anything like, certain, I don't know, distorted nationalism, so as to accept others. But you only accept others when you actually are proud and confident in the values that you have and what you're for. And it just seems to me that like Germany, for example, like has a real big problem because they're not really able, or maybe what they're for, as you see in these, responses to JD Vance's talk, it's actually lacking in some substance. And so there needs to be like much more of an integrated vision, and attractive, beautiful vision that that European society needs to invite the immigrant into, so that they then want to assimilate with that. And it just seems, I remember like so many years ago watching a documentary about some of the problems in Germany with people who, particularly, Muslim communities who are not integrating into the society. And they were like, wait a minute, they don't defend the German Constitution. And then they were saying that all these other things like, rights and et cetera, et cetera. But I think there needs to be something more than just that you're presenting to them.
Yeah, I think this is something that Manon and Ratzinger write about specifically. That it's not that Western nations shouldn't be or can't be something like diverse or even kind of multi-religious or multi-ethnic or something like that. But it simply won't work if they're not integrating into a culture that has a basis, right? It has to be based in something, because you can't, in a sense, like sort of build something that is officially neutral. It's just not going to work, right?
Yeah.
But that reminds me of something that might be, something to keep in mind if I were somebody like JD Vance, or somebody who, and I'm sympathetic to this kind of, one's own nation first kind of way of thinking. But as Christians, we do also need to remember that, in a sense, our primary loyalty is to fellow Christians, right? Like, if you are a member of the body of Christ, it doesn't matter if you are an American Christian or a Mexican Christian or whatever, right? That actually, I think, technically is the right way for us to be thinking of how charity is applied. So yeah, I mean, it's tough because like you're still then talking about somebody maybe in some other part of the world that you don't have an easy connection to, right? But I don't know. I mean, it's still something worthwhile that like we do as Christians, we are bound to a kind of connection to other Christians, even if they're not members of our own polity, right?
Yeah. No, that's right. It seems. I mean, I'm thinking that you take that stance. And maybe that precisely is the stance where you're the kind of the other, focusing on them, and it's not the ethnic national bond it's important, but not the primary thing.
Yeah. I don't know. We'll have to see. Well, on that note, Bobby, any other topics we haven't gotten to today?
Well, I mean, I just want to mention this, Andrew. Your book is coming out soon, so just encourage a lot of people to go, take a look at that. You said it's not out just yet, right?
No, here I'll hold it up for everyone to look at. It's called The Faith Unboxed, and the subtitle is "Freeing the Catholic Church from the Containers People Put It In." I did not make up that subtitle. I'm told that it makes good marketing material, but. What I'm trying to do in this book, I guess, as a convert to the Catholic faith, is dispel some misperceptions of what people think of when they think of the Catholic Church, whether they just think of it as a kind of big denomination, or whether they think of Catholicism as just a kind of ideology that can compete with liberalism or Marxism or whatever it may be. And I get into all kinds of different things in there. It's written for a popular audience, so I'm making it sound real highfalutin. It's not really. But anyway, it's due out on March 20th, and you can pre-order a copy right now, wherever you buy your books.
Well, I'm definitely going to be taking a look at that book, so I can't wait.
All right. Well, I guess on that note, then we'll do this again real soon. We have we're getting back in the swing. We have a good guest that we're going to be talking to next week, I believe, and then we're going to just keep rolling on from there. So we appreciate everybody's patience, everybody's continued support of what we're doing.
Yeah,
and we have a lot of exciting plans.
Yeah, look forward to it. Father and Belly. So some of you could probably already know about Father and Belly's work, but yeah, we're excited to have him on.
Yeah. And if you're watching this on YouTube, we'd love for you to leave a comment. We check those personally, and we'd love to engage with you. Wherever you get your podcast, be sure that if you're not subscribed already, that you go ahead and click that button and share this episode with friends. Maybe go back into our catalog. If you don't care so much about our conversation, you might enjoy one of the ones we've had with somebody a little more important than we are. So for now, then, we thank you for listening and watching, and God bless, and live in hope.